Russian assets worth more than 200 billion euros have been kept in EU countries. There is no talk about their confiscation, but over the past 6 months, the EU has developed a mechanism for transferring the proceeds from frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. On July 23rd, Brussels announced that in August, Kyiv will receive the first tranche of 1,400 million euros, and by the end of the year, another billion. The Ukrainian government plans to use the received funds for defense needs.
In February 2022, the world watched as Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a conflict that would reshape international relations and spark a wave of unprecedented sanctions. In the aftermath, Western nations, led by the European Union and the G7, froze billions of dollars in Russian state assets. Today, Europe's leaders are at a crossroads. Should they release these frozen funds, estimated at around $200 billion, to bolster Ukraine's defense and reconstruction efforts? Following the invasion, Western governments acted swiftly. As part of a coordinated economic response, assets belonging to the Russian central bank and state-owned entities were immobilized. Financial institutions, such as Euroclear in Brussels, became the custodians of these funds, with the majority of the estimated $200 billion locked away in European accounts, and only a meager $5 billion held by the United States. The assets soon emerged as a potent political tool. Over the past 3 years, the frozen reserves have not only symbolized the economic isolation of Russia, but have also sparked a contentious debate within the European Union. On one side of the divide, Eastern European nations, including Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and the Czech Republic, argue that these assets represent an immediate resource to help Ukraine fend off further aggression and rebuild its shattered infrastructure. On the other, larger EU economies, such as France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, along with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, caution against a premature release, citing legal, diplomatic, and financial risks. Estimates consistently point to frozen assets amounting to roughly $200 billion, with some reports occasionally suggesting figures closer to $300 billion. In recent months, pressure has mounted from the eastern flank of Europe. Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna has been particularly vocal, urging the EU to seize the frozen assets as a means of replacing any potential shortfall in Western support for Ukraine. If the US decides to withdraw or scale back its aid, we must have an alternative to ensure Ukraine can defend itself, Tsahkna stated at a press briefing. His words encapsulate a growing sentiment among the Baltic states and other neighboring countries, for whom the security threat posed by Russia feels immediate and personal. The timeline of this debate is as dynamic as it is complex. In 2022, the initial sanctions served as a powerful deterrent, freezing Russian assets in response to aggression. By 2023, Western nations had begun to extract profits from these frozen funds, channeling the interest into a $50 billion loan for Ukraine, a measure designed to provide a stopgap while longer-term strategies were debated. However, as the conflict dragged on and geopolitical alliances shifted, calls to use the full extent of these assets gained momentum. By early 2025, the divergence in opinion within the EU had become stark. Eastern and Northern European states, acutely aware of their vulnerability to Russian aggression, began to push for an immediate and full seizure of the assets. They argue that releasing the funds could significantly strengthen Ukraine's ability to sustain its defense and accelerate reconstruction efforts, a task estimated by the World Bank to cost around $486 billion. In contrast, France, Germany, Italy, and others warned that such a move could erode Europe's negotiating leverage and set a dangerous precedent in international law. While the EU holds roughly $200 billion in Russian assets, the United States controls only about $5 billion of such funds. This discrepancy not only highlights Europe's unique position, but also underscores the potential influence these assets could exert in future negotiations with Moscow. Proponents of the seizure argue that if Russia is to regain access to its funds, it must first make significant concessions, most notably, paying reparations for the damages inflicted on Ukraine. Yet, the legal hurdles are formidable. Major EU members contend that seizing sovereign assets could be deemed illegal under international law. They stress that the current framework was designed to freeze assets as a punitive measure, not to transfer them unilaterally to another state. The legal ambiguity is compounded by concerns over investor confidence. Critics warn that any drastic action could unsettle global financial markets and undermine the euro's status as a reserve currency. This internal division within the EU is not merely theoretical. In recent high-level meetings, voices from Eastern Europe have clashed with those of their Western counterparts. Baltic states and countries like Poland and the Czech Republic have argued that political will must triumph over technical legalities, insisting that the existential threat posed by Russian aggression justifies bold measures. Conversely, leaders in France and Germany caution that any unilateral seizure could lead to protracted legal battles and diminish Europe's bargaining power in subsequent peace talks. This sentiment reflects the cautious approach favored by many EU diplomats. They propose that the funds should remain frozen until Russia agrees to a comprehensive peace deal, one that includes not only reparations for Ukraine, but also guarantees for long-term European security. In effect, the assets are seen not just as a financial reservoir, but as a strategic lever in negotiations with Moscow. Meanwhile, on the ground in Ukraine, the implications of this debate are profound. Ukraine's leadership has repeatedly emphasized that the frozen assets represent more than just a source of funding. They symbolize the international community's commitment to Ukrainian sovereignty. With war and reconstruction costs mounting, Ukraine stands to benefit enormously from any infusion of resources. The challenge, however, lies in reconciling divergent EU positions at a time when swift action is imperative. Recent discussions between the United States and Russia have excluded the EU, a development that has further fueled calls from within Europe for a more assertive role. Some European leaders now see the seizure of Russian assets as a means of reclaiming their influence on the international stage. By leveraging these funds, they hope to compel Moscow to engage in meaningful dialogue and ultimately agree to reparations and territorial concessions. The discussion over these frozen assets encapsulates a broader dilemma facing Europe, balancing legal and economic principles against urgent political and security needs. On one hand, the strict application of international law is a cornerstone of the global order, a standard that, if eroded, could have long-term repercussions for investor confidence and diplomatic stability. On the other hand, the extraordinary circumstances of war compel a re-examination of traditional norms. For many Eastern European leaders, the argument is not merely legal, it is existential. Looking ahead, the decision on whether to release these funds is poised to have far-reaching consequences. A swift, decisive move could provide Ukraine with the resources necessary to rebuild its infrastructure, strengthen its military, and accelerate its path toward long-term recovery. Moreover, it could serve as a powerful deterrent to future acts of aggression, not just from Russia, but from any nation that might test the resolve of the international community. Conversely, if the EU maintains its cautious stance and leaves the assets frozen, the region may continue to rely on intermittent interest payments and smaller-scale loans. Such an approach preserves Europe's legal leverage, but could risk prolonging Ukraine's suffering and emboldening Russian ambitions. The debate also carries implications for the international financial system. Any precedent set by seizing sovereign assets unilaterally might prompt similar challenges in future conflicts, potentially destabilizing global markets and the delicate balance of international law. The fate of these frozen assets remains uncertain. Will the EU choose to wield them as a decisive tool to bolster Ukraine's future, or will legal caution prevail, leaving this vast reservoir untouched? The answer will not only shape the course of the Ukraine conflict, but may also redefine the limits of economic statecraft in the 21st century.